Hello, global gardeners. It's good to be back. I've noticed a lot of you are back from missed internet, all kinds of problems that many of us have periodically. So I was caught up in the global computer problems last week and had flights canceled as I was attempting to get home for the Monday live stream. Didn't make it. So I'm very glad to be back. And it's great to have the rest of you here, including those of you that haven't been around for a while. Today, going to be talking about the gardening tips, and I'll definitely be getting more into that. Let's go ahead and start with a question from Nan from Wisconsin saying, we've had lots of rain this summer, more than normal. My ever bearing strawberries are not producing any berries like they did last year. Could it be too much rain? So, like most garden plants, the weather does play a very important factor. So, too much rain, too much sun, too much wind, too much heat can all affect the plants that need to fertilize the flowers to produce a fruit. Strawberries fall into that category. Now, I'm growing one type of strawberry. It's my only type that's not ever bearing. It's a June bearing type of strawberry, and I rarely get fruit on it because of my climate and my weather. And just about the time that the flowers are starting to develop, and this year I had a ton of flowers on that plant, the weather hit it so hard that almost none of them turned into strawberries. So, yes, it could be weather related, could be too much rain, uh, drowning out the pollen and affecting the pollinization. But I think more likely is it could be the age of the strawberry. Now, strawberries don't live forever, and they don't produce fruit for more than just a couple years. So some varieties are better than others, but generally, after about 2 or 3 years, the strawberry plant is either going to stop producing fruit or you're going to see a dramatic reduction in fruit. The first year, you'll see some berries on an ever-bearing plant. Typically, the second year is really, really good. And then the third year, you might get some, you might not get any at all. So here's the first tip of the day. Swap out your strawberries. Knowing that they're only going to produce well in a 2 to 3 year cycle, make sure you always have new plants in the ground. And the best way to do that, of course, is with the runners. So as your strawberry plants are sending out runners, allow some of those runners to root because they'll be the plants that next year potentially are going to be producing quite well. And the mother plant, after a year or two, just take it out of the ground because it's not producing well enough yet. And so by using that basic propagation method of runners, rooting, removing the old plants, and keeping that cycle on a 2 to 3 year cycle, you're more likely to get a consistent harvest of the strawberries that you're hoping for. So nice to see everybody here. I see that Jay has checked in, our fabulous moderator. I haven't seen Heidi check in yet, but I'll keep looking. A week ago, last weekend, on the Urban Gardener channel, Jay Dixon was the guest. It was a wonderful interview that Enoch did. And so check out the Urban Gardener channel to see all the wonderful things that Jay had to say. So I'm so privileged to have Jay and Heidi here as moderators or facilitators. The only word that YouTube allows us or gives us the title is moderator, but you're awesome. So nice to have you here. Betty Charney's wondering, would you do an episode on either debunking or confirming all suggestions out there on social media praising coffee grounds, salt, and bananas? I already have it. I actually have a couple of them, and I'm sure Jay is looking it up right now. I think it was last year. I did a video debunking a whole bunch of myths. It debunked eggshells, bananas. I talked about coffee grounds in there. So yes, I've already done that video. And I even talked about it a couple weeks ago in the last live stream about some of the information that is out there and offered as a tip, but really isn't a good tip. So I'm sure by the time I finish this sentence that Jay will probably have already put the link to that video. But I have a specific video with all of those things debunked. And then I have a whole bunch of videos where I bring up those topics as I'm talking about something else that is a better approach to doing it. And so now when we talk about the tips and what we're doing in the garden, gardening is relatively unique, mostly unique when it comes to hobbies and activities that we do that keep us busy, that we like, because gardening has no rules. Gardening has no set way to do things. If you are a competition bridge player and that's what your favorite hobby is, well, bridge has very specific rules. And the partners have very specific guidelines that they will follow to determine how they bet, how they play, because it's very structured. And that holds true with a lot of the things in our life. When you go to work, it's structured. You have to do things in a certain way at a certain time, following a certain sequence. When it comes to gardening, you can pretty much do whatever you want, which is why you see so many gardeners giving different advice, because it may work for them and they throw it out to everybody else as a tip, but it may not necessarily work for somebody else. A tip is intended to be useful information. It's a helpful hint. And so if I find something that works well for me, I want to be helpful. Gardeners are helpful kind of people, and I'm going to share that with others. So I give you this tip that worked in my garden with the idea that maybe it will work in your garden. The problem is it doesn't always work. But the benefit of us sharing tips is that often the tips become more than just a suggestion. And it really does become a roadmap, points along our journey that really help to make everything better. So for example, and I'll give a shout out to Heidi now. I saw that she has signed in. So we've got both Heidi and Jay here with us today. It's always fantastic to have you here. And I just wanted to highlight this from Jay. There's the 7 big gardening myths busted with a good link, and you'll see a lot that's on there. And I will be making more of those kind of videos as time goes by. And like I said, I have the live stream. We talked about a lot of that stuff on the live stream. And then, of course, there's the link for the Urban Gardener live cast that Jay was on. So make sure you make note of those and check them out as well. So anyway, the point that I wanted to begin this discussion with, if you do a search of the best gardening tips, you're going to see some consistency. A tip starts off as a helpful hint, and it can become so ubiquitous. It's the kind of thing that we all end up doing. But recognize that a tip is a choice. You can either do it or not do it. And all of us have the opportunity to make that choice. Now, through searches online, the number one tip tends to be something along the lines of put your garden bed in the right location where it gets plenty of sun. Now, many of us begin to look at something like that, not necessarily as a tip, but just as a standard way to garden. A good idea for gardening is to put your bed where it gets full sun. However, what if you are growing shade-loving plants? Well, that's why it's not a rule, because we don't put every bed in full sun. It depends on what we're growing. If I want to grow hostas, I can't put them in full sun. I have to put them in a shady spot. So the tip of choosing your location in full sun is exactly that. It's a helpful hint that is appropriate for most vegetable gardens and most of the fruiting plants that we're going to be putting into our landscape. But it's not true for everything. Another great tip that you'll see when you look at the top 10 list is to place your garden beds close to a water source. I've said this before, and I've got videos on helpful tips. And I start off by talking about placing it in sun, and I then move on to begin talking about putting it near a water source, because you got to give your plants water. And this is the difference between a tip and basically a, a method we need to keep our plants alive. Plants need water. So if I were to say water your plants, well, that's not a tip. That's a guideline. You have to water your plants. You can choose not to do it, but if your plants don't get water, they're going to die. I could add to it, water your plants in the morning, because they have a good fresh start before the hot sunny day. The soil will be moist, and you'll avoid some of the common issues that might arise if you have mold and mildew in a high humid environment. That's a tip. Water in the morning. I could just as easily say water your plants in the evening. After the heat of the day, the plants are stressed, they're maybe wilting a little bit, the soil has dried out. So get in there and water the soil so that the plants can revive. They're going to grow overnight. So a nice moist soil going into the nighttime is a good idea so that they're ready to start the day tomorrow morning. That's a tip. Two completely different tips on when to water. And you get to be the one to choose which one you prefer, or neither. You may prefer to water during the middle of the afternoon. Most gardeners are going to recommend against that. But if that's what you choose to do, then you don't need to follow the morning tip and you don't need to follow the evening tip. You do what works best for you. And that's the thing about tips. And I've tried to stress this in recent weeks, that just because you get some gardening advice, even from me, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best advice for you. And so as we look at tips like put your bed in full sun, put it near a water source. Number 3 on the list is typically something about the soil. And you know me, I love good soil. I think that's actually the number one thing to consider about success in the garden, is having good soil, building the soil, amending the soil, paying attention to the life in the soil. But that's a tip. You don't have to do that. If you don't want to spend the time building good soil, you can grow in clay pellets. You can grow in sand. You can grow in anything you want, and then provide all the nutrients that the plants need through fertilizers. Now, I'm not big on fertilizers because I'm big on soil. So my tip, and the tip of many other gardeners, is build a good soil for your beds. But it's not necessary. You could offer another tip, and the Mendenhall method of gardening is one that does this. It doesn't focus on the soil at all. It uses clay balls or pellets, basically an inert substance that is the growing medium. And then everything that the plant needs comes by way of fertilizers. So if you choose to grow that way, now a tip might be fertilize every 2 weeks, or fertilize with high nitrogen early in the season and fertilize with high phosphorus at the midpoint of the season. Those are tips if you're choosing to garden without a focus on the soil and a focus primarily on the fertilizer. And so as we talk about all these different tips, it's very important to recognize the tip, the purpose of the tip, and really whether it fits with what you're doing. Who made the tip and what are they really talking about? I just this morning, as I was getting ready for this live stream, was looking at some of these tips to kind of balance what's good and what's bad and what I was going to talk about. And one of them is to fertilize every 2 weeks over the course of the growing season. And that's it. That was pretty much all the tips said. It didn't say what kind of fertilizer. It didn't say whether it was in a clay ball method or a really good soil method. It was just, my plants do best when I fertilize every 2 weeks. Well, there's a lot of gardeners out there, particularly new gardeners, who might follow that advice and then end up asking a question at the end of the season. Why didn't I get any tomatoes? Why did the flowers fall off of my pepper plant? There are some potential downfalls if you have too much fertilizer. Too much nitrogen is going to give you a wonderful big green bushy plant and very few flowers and fruit. And so you really have to take into account the context of the tip. Who is it really focused on? And is it intended as a helpful hint because the person giving the tip has done it? Or is it just passing on information that you heard from somebody else? And so often I see tips that are just passed on without really any guidance as to whether it works or not. It's just somebody heard it and they're going to tell somebody else about it. And that's kind of how some of this information gets passed along. But when you look at these tips that are so prevalent, the top 10 of everybody's list, I think they move beyond the tip realm into the playbook realm, or like I was talking about earlier, the roadmap. There are some things that all of us are doing for the most part when we talk about sun and water and soil and sowing and taking care of the plants and harvesting. And while they might technically be a tip because we have no rules in gardening, it instead, I think, really ventures into a different category, which you can define it how you choose, but that's why I say it's more of a guideline. I think, particularly for new gardeners, we have to be careful because if you're seeing the tip of putting your plants in full sun and then your plants do great, that's a great tip. And then you see a tip that says build up great soil and your plants do okay, well, then you might continue along those lines. That's a good tip. And then you see another tip that says fertilize regularly and your plants do even better. Well, that's a great tip for you. So that's what you do. And then you see a tip that says bury an egg 1 foot below your tomato plant. And you go, I'm going to do that because all these other tips have worked. Well, it it can reach the point like we began with debunking some of these tips that are out there. We just get in this pattern of trying all these new things because they're offered to us, and then they work, and then we try a new one and that seems to work, and before we know it, we're doing all of these tips. And like I was talking about a couple weeks ago, I think a big issue when some of these things like burying banana peels or burying eggshells or burying coffee grounds, all of which have minimal, if any, impact on your plants. Well, the plants are doing great because you did all those other things beforehand. You did put your bed in a good spot. You did put it close to a water source. You did put good soil in it and you've maintained your soil. You did choose plants that are appropriate for your area. Now, I mean, that seems like common sense, but that's a tip. Choose plants that will grow in your climate. You don't have to take that tip, but it's good advice. And then we move that further where we do things like prune off the lower branches on your tomato plants up to 12 or 15 inches. The reason for that is because it reduces the likelihood of disease that might come from the soil. Another tip is mulch your beds. That also helps cut down on potential disease and also helps retain some of the soil moisture. These are all top tips that many of us are doing. Well, because we're doing all of these other things, which we don't even think about as tips anymore, we just think about it as that's how we garden. When we're exposed to some of these things that I have debunked, and some of you are looking whether they should be debunked or not, it's a pattern that we follow, and that's what I'm suggesting as well today is take these good tips, the best tips, the ones that you see everybody recommending, and do them, try them or not, see how they work for you, and then add them to your toolbox of regular activities and continue doing that, even with the new tips, the tips that are kind of out there a little bit, that are maybe more questionable and they seem to work, but are they working because of all the other tips you did before that point? Or are they working because something magical has suddenly happened to your garden? And I suggest the whole garden is magical. Everything you do is magical. And the 50 tips that you followed to get to the point that you are right now, that's what's important, not necessarily one new thing. It seems to make sense and it seems to have an effect when really it might not at all. And so Owen is, yeah, so also dispelling the overwatering myth and the process of growing hydro or aquaponics. Uh, yeah, so like I said, you could grow plants in clay pellets, you can grow plants in water. Aquaponics and hydroponics are methods where the roots are fully immersed in water. Now, there are other aspects of it. If I were to give you a tip to say the best way to grow lettuce is in water, just put your seeds on a floating mat and you're going to have great lettuce. Well, that's a little simplistic. The basic idea is good. The tip is good. I've grown great lettuce in my hydroponic system, but the roots need nutrients. The roots still need oxygen. And so, in still water, their plants are probably going to die. And that's kind of what happens in the garden often when we overwater and we allow the water to stagnate around the roots. That drowns the roots. It does have an effect, but the water drains away. When we talk about hydroponics and aquaponics, we have some type of infusion of oxygen, either with a bubbling system, or I had the ebb and flow method where the water would flow out to allow the oxygen to come in. The plants still need to grow the way the plants still need to grow. But it shows how just a simple idea of overwatering really doesn't give the full answer, because when we talk about, and I think this is what Owen is saying, when we talk about hydroponics and aquaponics, we're definitely overwatering our plants, and we're introducing the oxygen and the nutrients through that oxygen to make sure, or through that water to make sure the plants are getting everything they need. And so that's why I say it's all about the context as to whether it's going to work, whether it's not going to work. And so I'd love for you in the comments, tell me some of the top tips, and if you can, a tip that started as a tip maybe when you were a brand new gardener, and has evolved into a preferred method of gardening. I think tips can evolve and become a method. You still always have that yes or no choice on a particular gardening method, but it might start off as a tip. So, what are you doing out there that started off as a tip, and now that you're doing it, it's something that you tell others about as a tip? You want to share that helpful hint, so you are offering it as a tip, whereas it's the way you're doing it. It's one of those things that you, you can't not do. I can't not put my bed in a good location. I can't not amend my soil. I mean, these are things that are so ingrained with how I garden now that it's my Gardener Scott method. I grow my vegetables in raised beds. I grow my vegetables with a good soil that I amend on a regular basis. I mulch all of my beds. I go out to the garden every single day to tend to my plants. I prune selectively to keep the plants under control. These are all tips that if you're not doing it, you might consider doing it. Most of my videos are filled with tips showing you how I do something, and you might want to take that on as an idea in your garden. So, the internet, YouTube is filled with helpful tips. I think it's a good idea to actually try a lot of these things to see if they do work. Or, and the reason I try so many of these tips is so I can debunk them and show, it doesn't work, and then explain why it doesn't work. Because as we move forward, it's that roadmap. It's that journey that gets us through our gardening world. And we have to be selective. We can't do everything. We can't grow using the Ruth Stout method and the Minute Hall method and the Back to Eden method and the uh, pick one that you like to use, the straw bale gardening method. These are all different ways of gardening. They're tips, suggestions on how to do it, but there might be some similarities between them, but there's a lot of differences in them as well. And so as we look at all these different methods, be selective in the methods you're using, just like you are in the tips, because a tip can lead to a method. And when you start a method without fully understanding what it is, you need more and more tips about how to do that particular method. So I know it becomes kind of a rabbit hole and circular logic with some of this stuff, but it's important to begin with some of that basic information that we work with. And so Split Spine One is saying, oh, Hoyas are the best tip ever. And so, yes, for me as well, I think Oyas are great. I've mentioned this before whenever the Oyas come up, that I've been working on an Oya video for 2 years where I make my own Oyas. So an Oya is basically a clay pot filled with water that's buried in the ground. And the idea is that you fill the Oya with water and it gradually seeps out to keep the soil evenly moist. In dry regions like the southwest of the United States, where this idea is much more prevalent, and the tip you'll hear a lot more often, makes a lot of sense. Our soil is dry. We need help to keep it moist. And so having an Oya in the bed really makes a difference. However, and this is where you have to understand the context. In Scotland, where they have had just a couple days of sunshine this year and lots of rain. My buddy Tony O'Neill on the Simplified Gardening channel had a video recently where he was filming in the sun for the first time in weeks and weeks and weeks. You get these regions that are filled with rain and cool weather, and the soil is not drying out, then an Oya isn't one of those things that they would necessarily consider as a good tip. So while I think for me in my garden, it is one of the best tips, it may not be appropriate for everybody, but try it. If you live in an area that gets a lot of rain, go ahead and bury that clay pot. And you'll probably see that it stays full all the time because your soil is moist all the time and that water really has nowhere to go. And then you can judge for yourself whether it's something you're going to do. You don't see wet region people talking about Oyas very often because it's not needed. DLR 978 says the only tip I've ever generated, use BT on stem vine borers. It will save your plant and you might even still get fruit. There you go. Great tip. BT is Bacillus thuringiensis. So it's a bacteria. Actually, there are a number of different bacterias that are sold as BT, and they target the insects that are going to eat your stems, eat your leaves. You sprinkle the BT on it, they get it in their gut, and it kills the insect. Great organic way to deal with pests in your garden. It's biological. It's what nature does. It's a bacteria that only affects those insects that have a gut that they're going to be eating the bacteria. Doesn't affect people, doesn't affect birds, doesn't affect dogs. It is a wonderful tip if you have insect problems. So completely agree that BT is a tip that that many gardeners now use as a method. I don't have that big a pest problem because with my integrated pest management system, I've got my birds, I've got my predatory insects, I've got my variety of plants, and my pest problems are minimal. So, do I have BT in my shed? Of course I do. Have I used it in the past? Yes, I have. Have I had to use it recently? No. So, it's a great tip, but it again is in context of what pests you have and whether you need it at all. If someone were to tell me right now to dust my plants with BT every 6 weeks, I would ignore that tip because I don't need the BT because I don't have the pest problem that the BT will cure. And so, kind of like the idea of fertilize every 2 weeks, there are a lot of these things that become methods for gardeners that for them, yeah, BT may need to be put on every 6 weeks. Or DE, diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is a great way to rid yourself of some of these pests sprinkling on the leaves. Once it rains, it's going to dissipate. So I've seen tips that say add diatomaceous earth over your squash leaves every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks. Well, that's because the idea is that you're going to have the wind and the rain wash the DE, diatomaceous earth, off of the leaves and you need to reapply. But if you've gotten rid of the pest, then you don't need to reapply. And so the tip initially is a good one, but the sustained use of that tip may not be necessary. I know it starts becoming quite confusing as to what you do, what you don't do, whether you're going to do it, whether you're not going to do it, and how you approach your garden. I like this approach. Mobius 981 says, I routinely traverse my garden in the morning with hose and clippers, a joyful touch earth time. Absolutely. And I talked a lot about this the last time, where I say a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. A lot of these tips work. A lot of these tips are kind of neutral. You might think they work, but the reason they're working is because you're out in your garden every single morning with a hose and clippers. I love hand watering my plants every day so that I can get up close and personal, so that if any pests appear, I can deal with them right away. I can squish that squash bug and never have to worry about diatomaceous earth or Bacillus thuringiensis because I nip it in the bud before it becomes a problem. The hose can spray off aphids that are beginning to attack the plant. The clippers are there to do some of that pruning or cut down some of those weeds right at the soil surface before they get growing. So there's a lot of great ideas out there. Mulch, of course, is a wonderful idea. One of the things that mulch does is cut down on seed germination for weeds. And when the weeds do appear, they're easy to deal with. If you've got clippers in your pocket, great tip. Just pull them out, clip off any of the weeds or anything that's starting to become a problem in the garden. So for me, this is one of my methods. I've right now on the counter right next to my back door are pruners. And usually about 3 or 4 days a week as I go outside, I stick them in my pocket. Do all my normal tasks, all my normal watering, all my normal inspection, and I've got those pruners or clippers in my pocket ready to take action early. Is that a tip? Absolutely, it's a tip. But because I do it so regularly, for me, just add it to the long list of methods within my gardening approach. And so as we're proceeding and as you're uh, maybe marking down some of these things to try, think about this for the future. Kind of stick it in the back of your brain. The tips, and this is what I'd love to hear about, the tips that you started so long ago that you're continuing to do now, but also maybe new tips that you start this year, next year, and the year after. Look back and say, oh, I remember when I first started doing that. And if you can remember where the tip came from, I think it would be great to reach out to somebody and say, hey, 3 years ago, I found out about the strawberry rotation idea and I started doing that. And now I've had the best strawberries every single year that I've ever had before. So that's how we can kind of share the love and pass some of these ideas to others. Llama Llama is asking, this is the first year I've successfully grown black krim tomatoes. Awesome. I've heard to harvest them early because they over ripen very quickly. Is that what you found as well? Quickly is a relative term, but yes, the thing about the black crims is the shoulder of the black crim, the top right next to the stem, has green and purple color. It doesn't turn red. And the rest of the tomato isn't a red. It's a kind of a dark purpley red. And so a very common thing when gardeners are first growing the black krim is waiting for the tomato to turn that red that we might be used to, or to wait for those top shoulders to turn red, and they won't. And what happens is they actually stay on the plant longer than they should, and they over ripen. So I think maybe a better way to look at it is, are they are they worth harvesting early? And the answer is yes. It's better to harvest a plant like that. And there's a whole bunch of others. I'm growing some new tomatoes this year. Aunt Ruby's German green is one that is green when it's ripe. And so if you wait for one of those odd colored tomatoes to fully turn a color, it may never turn the color you're waiting for it to turn. So yeah, go ahead and harvest it early, as long as it's past the plush point, when it's not that light green that first emerges on the plant. Once it's started to darken, it will continue to ripen and you can use it. And so I don't have a big problem with overripe tomatoes because I'm usually out there every day regularly harvesting. So it might only be a day or two that they're overripe. But harvest a day or two early and you don't have to worry about that at all. And black krim is one of those that I have had an issue with, just because I have so many tomato plants. So I'll see a plant, it'll have a tomato on it, and I'll think, oh, I'll get that tomorrow. And then I just get distracted with all of the others on the next day. And it ends up being 2 or 3 days before I finally harvest it. And then, yeah, it's been a little bit too long. Deb McDonald, great idea. The biggest tip I ever received was don't give up. I loved that. And so actually, when I was watching The Urban Gardener with Enoch Graham talking to Jay Dixon, one of them, it might have been Jay, was talking about the idea. And there are varying statistics, but the numbers are very high for first-year gardeners that give up and don't come back. And for all of us that are here today, we're past that point. That's why you're watching this. That's why you're taking notes. That's why we're talking about tips to make things easier and better, because we haven't given up. Well, in the first year, this is great advice. Don't give up. It's hard. There's a lot to learn. I think, Deb, that this is not only great advice for the first year gardener, I think it's great advice for even the most experienced gardener, because the more experience we get, the more things we try. And it can be easy at some point to just give up. It's getting too hard, and we lose sight of how we began. We forget about the easy things because we've always challenged ourselves. And so we're putting in weird varieties. I had a neighbor a number of years back that built a greenhouse for his orchids. Loved orchids, great hobby, but it reached a point where he was trying more and more rare orchids that were so difficult to grow that he really wasn't enjoying it anymore. He loved growing orchids, put in a lot of time and effort, years, and a lot of money to grow his orchids. And then it reached the point where he just didn't like it as much anymore. It was too much work. Well, best advice in that situation, I think, is don't give up. Just change the way you're doing it. Go back to the easy. Go back to the stuff you liked, and maybe you'll rekindle that love of gardening that you once had and that you think that you should be maybe going back to. I think that can be important. Ready, Set, Homestead is with us today. There are many things that started as just a tip, and now it's just a method. I think the keep is that practice makes perfect. My son is a perfect example of this. My son is a perfect example of this too. Practice makes perfect. And that's a great way to say it, that the tip is something that we try. If we like it and keep doing it, it is that practice that makes it a method. In gardening, it's difficult to reach the point where it's perfect, but it can get darn close to perfect. You know, the black krim, this is the first year I'm not growing black krim, as I've talked about before, because I'm growing the white Tomasol and I'm growing the strawberry cherry. I'm growing new and unique varieties that I've never tried before. Well, I love black krim. Next year, I'm going to grow black krim. This year, it's these new things I'm growing based on tips from some of you that I selected these plants to grow. The ones I like, I'll bring them back and I'll keep practicing. And it becomes part of my garden for the future as I get closer to that perfection point. So, wishful thinking that the practice makes perfect in the garden, but that's what keeps us coming back. And so, yeah, when you look at the list of top 10 tips, weeds are going to be on that list. So thanks, Rick. Controlling weeds is a wonderful tip. If you take your pruners out and you snip off the weeds when they're early, that's fewer weed problems. If you mulch, that's fewer weed problems. If you learn to recognize the difference between the plants you are trying to grow and all the other plants in the bed, it can help when you determine which plants need to come out. I know that's a big issue for new gardeners, is all of a sudden the bed is filled with plants and they don't know which ones are weeds and which ones are what they're trying to grow. There's a lot involved with weed control, but it's a great tip. Control your weeds. I have my asparagus beds, 2 beds. One bed is okay, I'm managing it. It's got a few weeds in it. The other bed has just been overrun by weeds, primarily grasses. Not sure where they came from, blew in on the wind. And I've spent so much time weeding that bed, even with mulch, that I've just given up. I'm going to wait. I'm going to go back. I'll weed again, probably 2 or 3 more times. But the problem is that because of my travel, because of all my other focus in the garden, I allowed that one bed to get overrun. And now it's so much work that I'm avoiding it. The tip is to weed early and to control your weeds, as Rick says, so that it never actually gets to that point. Is it going to happen? Sure, it's going to happen. But that's one of those things that we can minimize it by being a little proactive, getting out there, taking care of things earlier rather than later. Jen Van Brunt is saying the best tip that is evolving into my gardening philosophy involves timing. Being in the Southeast US, I failed at brassicas several times. Been there, done that. Starting in spring, brassicas in fall is the only way I can have success. Great tip. Absolutely great tip. I talked a little bit about this in a video about fall crops that I did a year or 2 ago. I have the same issue. Brassicas just don't do well. Here in my Colorado garden, I'll start mini brassicas in spring, and just about the point they're doing great, summer arrives with a vengeance overnight. That's kind of what happened here this year. Is we had a relatively cool April and May, and then the first week of June, our temperatures soared. We were hitting 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, virtually overnight. And so we went from nights close to freezing. And 2 weeks later, we had days that were that hot. And that's not good for brassicas. They immediately bolt. And so all of those plants, the uh, particularly the one that I have the biggest problem is probably broccoli. So broccoli, broccolini, the cauliflower, the cabbage, so many of those plants. Napa cabbage I tried growing for years. I finally found a slow bolt variety that did pretty well. But when you're confronted with a sudden heat like that, your brassicas are going to bolt. It's just kind of what happens. They're hard to grow for those of us that are in the southeast because those are the kind of temperatures we get. Instead, great tip, put them in now in July, beginning of August. Put those plants in your garden because as the plants are growing and as the plants reach that point where they're going to put on their most growth, you're not going to have extremely hot days. You're going to have cool days. And brassicas love cool weather. And so grow your brassicas in the fall instead of the spring, and you may actually see much more success, especially if you've been struggling to get them growing. So I agree, Jen. That is one of the best tips that I discovered, and I didn't, and so a tip. Uh, as we talk about it like this, it's a tip. You were telling me, I'm telling everyone else, it's a tip. I kind of discovered more about brassicas just by doing it and trying to figure out why it wasn't working. I think I kind of figured out what was going to work because I had so much failure. And that gets back to the don't give up. There are so many things we learn from failure in our garden that leads us to a solution. And then when you hear it as a tip from somebody else, it just substantiates what you've maybe already figured out on your own and makes it more likely that you're going to share that tip with somebody else. Skippy says, I take a little bit from all methods and modify tips to meet my style of gardening. Well said. Absolutely. That is the lesson for today. It's all got context behind it, and it's your unique individual garden and your style of gardening. Absolutely. I love it. I think we should each have our own style of gardening. So thank you for that, Skippy, because that is exactly the way I approach tips is I listen to all of them. I often debunk before I ever try them, but there are some that I'll give it a try and see how it works. And then maybe it becomes part of my style, part of my method. Absolutely. I love that. Shannon says, keeping a journal has been my best tip. It really helps when you forget stuff between winter and next spring. Absolutely. I love the idea of a journal. I use video as my primary journal. There's a lot of videos I make really as a personal way to document what I'm doing in the garden as a personal garden journal. And of course, along the way, I'm showing you what I'm doing and I'm talking about what I'm doing. I also have the written journals, and it's amazing to go back in your journals, be they a paper journal or a video journal, and remind yourself of what it was you were saying years ago. My first garden journal, wow, that was 20 years ago because I was actually doing it while I was in the Master Gardener program. And I came across it a while back. I think I may have mentioned this in my video on garden journals and found the day that I actually finished the Master Gardener program. I'd forgotten all about that. I'd forgotten so much about that time, but I'd written about it in my garden journal. And years later was able to go back and remind myself of not necessarily what's happening in the garden, but events that are involved with gardening. So my garden journal includes what's happening in your gardening life in addition to the plants you're putting in the ground and how well they're doing and the weather and all those other factors. But absolutely, Shannon, journal is a fantastic way to ensure that you don't repeat some of those mistakes. Because I've also seen that. I've tried things that just aren't working, kind of like the brassicas. I've done that with year in, year out, tried new things. And a few years ago, I thought, I'm going to try this new thing. And I happened to come across one of my journals talking about that plant, and I had already tried it and it didn't work. That's the benefit of a journal. When you are trying so many things to try to make something work, you may repeat yourself because what you did made sense at the time. Well, years later, it still makes sense. So you might repeat it. Some plants. I was looking at some plants last year that I was considering growing. And when I looked at some of my previous journaling, I found out, oh no, I tried that tomato and it didn't do well. So, no, I'm not going to buy it because I don't want to have to go through all of that again. So, great suggestion. Absolutely great suggestion. Okay. Uh, Hanging out with Eli says, best tip I got when I was new was to make notes. Always make notes. Great idea. That ties in with the journal. It helps cement things in your memory, but also recording what you did and the outcome gives you resource material for years to come. There you go. Thank you for sharing that. And as I just said, I think that is a great idea. It doesn't have to be fancy. A lot of my journals are really nothing more than a spiral notebook that has a lot of notes in it, especially early in the season as I'm selecting my seed packets for the year, as I'm laying out the garden. I have a whole bunch of spiral notebooks that just handwritten notes, ideas. I'll start off the season with review during the fall, winter, early spring. If I have an idea, oh, I think I want to try this thing, I'll just make note of it in my notebook slash garden journal. And then as I begin putting together the plan for the garden, I'll review all those ideas that I had come up with over the course of a number of months. However you like to put a note in place to remind yourself, do it. Absolutely great advice. Okay, let's see. Masabi Gal saying, I have to cut back on my garden veggie areas. Any tips on how to systemically do so? I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. It's if you're having to take out some of your beds and you're going to put something else in place. But the way I approach when I make modifications or changes to my garden, where I garden, how I'm going to garden, is to prioritize, to look at what is most important for you. What do you want to grow? What do you need to grow, either from a food perspective or from a mental health well-being perspective? But what is it that you really want to get out of gardening? And make sure that you maintain that as a core. And so if you're like right now, I'm gardening in 9 of my 4x8 beds. And I generally plant them all, I rotate them around a little bit. But this year, as I was looking at the same kind of thing, I have to cut back on my vegetable garden because I've got lots of other projects I'm working on. It's taking too much time. I looked at those 9 beds and I really cut it back to 8 beds. And so right now it's actually at 7 beds because I harvested my garlic. So I'm only actively growing a summer garden in uh, 7 of my 9 beds. And when you really look at the first area, so when I talk about the beds, I'm talking about different size beds. So in the 4x8 area, having those empty beds has opened up the space for me to go ahead and this week, tomorrow, my granddaughters are coming over and we're going to sow the seeds for my fall garden. So nothing was growing in that bed. I don't like having bare beds. I love having plants all the time. I just didn't have the time to have all of these beds happening. The same with my garlic bed. Gonna leave it bare and probably nothing else is going to go into it this year. As one of the other beds, probably my cucumber bed, begins to fade at the end of the season, that's going to become my garlic bed. So as I prioritized what I wanted to grow and what I needed to grow, I recognized that there were a couple beds that I didn't have to grow. And so the other two that I was talking about, the long beds that are in underneath my covered area, I last year grew in 3 of the 4 beds. This year, I'm only growing in 2 or I grew in 3 of the 4 last year. This year, I'm only growing in 2 of the 4 for the same reason. Still have a ton of tomatoes, still have a ton of peppers and squash, but I've downsized. So that was my systematic approach, was to recognize my time, my space, what I needed, and to recognize that there was a lot of stuff I was growing that was just extra work that I really didn't need to have in the ground, and it was taking too much time. So I decided to just not do it. And that's a tip that that is how I did it, is to focus on what you need versus what you don't need. Maybe that'll help. Hey, Peter, nice to see you here. Don't be afraid to start plants inside as a tip, even things like cucumber or squash if you have pest issues. Great idea. Great idea. In fact, if you go to the planter YouTube, and actually, you might have to correct me, Peter, because I watched your video recently where you were putting the plants out into the garden. So Peter is with the planting app that I like to use. I've got a link below, the planter app, and great video where he shows some of the plants he's putting in the garden and talks a little bit about this. I like to do direct seeding in my garden, and I've often given the tip to gardeners to don't worry about growing it inside and just put them straight in the garden. Most of us have a long enough season, conditions will be great, and you can not have to worry about growing plants indoors. But this year, especially with the prompting here from Peter, I would say just the opposite. I would agree completely with Peter, because this year, some of those new melons that I want to try, they're relatively short days to harvest, but I put them in the ground, direct sown the seed, and they were very, very slow to germinate and begin growing. And then we had that excessive heat in June, and my melon plants they're not struggling. The plants themselves are pretty healthy, but they're about 4 to 5 weeks behind where I would like them to be. The tip to avoid that is exactly what Peter says. Start them indoors. If I would have started those melon plants indoors in peat pots and then put them outside at the point that I was sowing everything else, the plants would be much bigger than they are right now. And so my method of gardening is to direct sow all of my summer vegetables. But a tip that I'm going to use is basically what Peter is saying. Next year, for some of those plants that I'm finding struggle a little bit more, usually melons, I'm going to start melons indoors. So thank you for that, Peter. The planter YouTube page has got a lot of good information. If you've got the planter app on your phone or computer, ton of information on there with links to videos on things that you can do as well. So appreciate you being here today. Okay, let's see. I know I'm probably falling a little bit behind while I'm trying to catch up. Let me go ahead and talk about the background today. So this comes from Brent Perry, and we've seen Brent's garden before. And I don't know if you remember it, but one of the nice things that I always like to point out when Brent has shared pictures at different seasons is this is his front yard. If you look at the backyard, it looks like a nice spot with some trees and some lawn, but it's in the shade. So that first tip that we were talking about earlier today of put your garden where it gets sun, that's exactly what Brent did. And it meant he had to put it in his front yard, which for many people just they don't want to do. They want their garden in the back, and they're going to have their garden in the backyard regardless of whether it's a good spot or not. Well, you can have a wonderful garden that replaces your front yard, and especially if you live in a neighborhood where people like walking by and seeing a lush, bountiful garden, it definitely is going to fit in. Brent does a lot of different things. He grows in the low raised beds. You can see lots of grow bags this year. In fact, it almost looks like there's more space in the grow bags than there are in the raised beds. I've talked about this before. Another great tip: if you have limited space, you don't have to put in ground beds, and you don't have to put in raised beds. Consider container gardening. Consider the pots, and consider the grow bags as an option to line your garden instead of having the path that is 4 feet wide, and you can kind of see this, a 4 foot wood chip mulch as a path around the beds. Go ahead and fill 15 inches of that path with a grow bag, and you've just extended what you can grow in the garden. And when we're talking about expanding our garden, I think that's a great way to begin expanding. Rather than automatically putting in new beds, put in the grow bags. Might help, especially if you become overwhelmed with it all and you have to start thinking about cutting back on your vegetable gardening. Well, it's easier to cut back by not growing in a container than it is to cut back with not growing in 3 of your 9 beds or whatever it happens to be. So I love the grow bag aspect. One of the things, and I look forward to seeing future photos that Brent will share, but you can't see it, but he's added some plants next to the brick on his house. And so he's actually going to be growing some tall vining plants that will be covering the brick at the front of the house. I think that'll be fantastic. And of course, this bush that has become overwhelming started off as just a small shrub, but it's in full sun, obviously gets attention because he's out there every day and is filling the back of the garden, which is actually the front of the house. So other things, you can see a bamboo teepee trellis. You can see lots of other pole trellises, lots more of the teepee on each side. So lots of vertical growth. Another great tip: if you are growing in a small space, but you want to grow a lot of plants, grow vertically, grow up. Use trellises. Instead of letting your cucumbers sprawl all over the ground, train them to grow up a trellis. And now you can grow more cucumbers in the same bed that would have been 1 or 2 plants sprawling and taking over everything. So always nice to see what you're doing in the garden, Brent. Thank you for sharing this. I appreciate it. And maybe it's given you some ideas. That's the wonderful thing about tips, is we can throw them out there, and if they stick, if it's something you might try, if you hadn't really thought much about using bamboo canes as a trellis for vertical growing, there, you can see it in practice. Maybe it might be something that you want to try. If you weren't sure about the grow bags, add some grow bags. You don't have to start with, I didn't count the grow bags, but I think there's probably 12 to 15, if not more, 12 to 15 in one row. And it looks like there's a couple rows. So a lot of grow bags. You don't have to start that big. Brent didn't start that big. Start with 2 grow bags or 4 5-gallon buckets. Then once you have it figured out, if you like it, it becomes a method, and you start growing in grow bags and buckets all the time. So that's really a great way to approach it. Yankee Sister Homestead, thank you so much for that. Always a great time to catch the best tips. Thanks, Gardener Scott, and all fellow gardeners. You all are priceless. Completely agree. And that's one of the best tips of all actually, is to hang out here on Mondays and read the comments that are happening, because I've addressed many of these as I've seen them come by, but there's a lot of stuff I know that's been scrolling through, and I've missed it. But keep up the good work, keep chatting back and forth, keep helping each other out. And I can see that Mobius 981 and others are talking about comfrey. Comfrey is one of those things that for me started as a tip. I'd never heard of comfrey. Comfrey is a plant that is a pretty regular part of permaculture as a dynamic accumulator. It's a plant with deep roots, and it brings a lot of those nutrients up to the leaves, and then the leaves can be used as mulch. They can be turned into a liquid fertilizer. And I like it because it's one of the first plants that flowers in the spring. So it's great for pollinators in my garden while it's still cold before other plants are beginning to flower. So I also think it's a great looking plant. So what for me is now a regular part of my garden, I just added 2 new comfrey plants back in my mini orchard this year, in addition to the 2 I have in the front yard and the 2 I have in my central garden area. And now I'm adding 2 more. I love it. It's a great plant. Started as a tip. For me, I would say comfrey is a method plant. It's something that I'm going to continue to add to my garden. I don't always use it as a fertilizer or a mulch. It's just another great plant to have in the garden. And so I use it as much as a decorative plant as anything else. Those are the kind of things when we grow something that does well for us, share that with other gardeners in your area as a tip. Hey, comfrey's working great. The problem with comfrey is finding it to put in the ground in the first place. And I was lucky to get cuttings to root cuttings. So then we talk about comfrey. If you have just a traditional generic heirloom kind of variety of the comfrey, it will flower in seed, and some of those seeds will sprout, and you'll have little comfrey plants. But you can have a sterile variety. Bocking 14 is a variety of comfrey that won't set seed, because once you have comfrey in the ground, it's really hard to get rid of. You need to really get control over it. The reason I've added 2 more is because I was able to dig up 2 small plants near one of my older plants and transplant them to another area before that area got overgrown with comfrey plants. But the tip is, if you can find someone that has a comfrey plant, ask them, of course, ahead of time, but just dig down and just pluck off a little bit of the root. I find that it is so easy to grow from a root cutting, much easier than from seed, that's really the easiest and best way to propagate it if you can find someone that already has a comfrey plant. If you don't have that option, there are a couple sites that you can search for online that sell the seed, and then you have to go through the whole process of raising the plant. It takes a little while for the plant to become established, but great plant to have in the garden. And the Sabigal has that variety of comfrey with each fruit tree. And that's what I started doing. I'm not going to necessarily put them with each of my fruit trees, but that's the idea. They bring up nutrients for the tree, and then I chop and drop it around the tree for mulch. And that's exactly what I'm doing in the other areas of my garden that I've got the comfrey. The 2 I added, honestly, I added as landscape plants that are at the end of one of the pathways that I'm building. But as I expand out and put in more comfrey plants, I will be doing that around some of my berries and some of my fruit trees as well. So it starts off as a tip and becomes just a regular way that you're growing. And that's one of the things when we start analyzing our method, the way we like to garden, it's recognizing how far we've come and a lot of those things that we need to do to keep it going. John's asking about the best way to drop pH. I talk about this in my video with the blueberries. I think the name of the video, Jay, no doubt will find it, is how to make blueberry soil. Blueberry soil needs to be acidic. Azalea soil need to be acidic. There's a lot of soils that the plant really needs a low pH. And many of us just don't have soil with a low pH. My native soil is actually alkaline. And so when I want to grow something like that, I either have to create my own soil or I have to do something drastic to lower the pH. And really, the best way to lower the pH of soil is elemental sulfur. And there are lots of bags out there that you can buy, different types of sulfur, and some are slow acting, some are long acting. The key is that you really are changing the structure of the soil. And so the elemental sulfur in elemental form is really necessary to lower the pH and sustain a low pH. Adding vinegar doesn't work, and you're going to kill all the soil life. It will lower the pH temporarily until it washes away, causes much more damage than it's worth. Pine needles and coffee grounds aren't acidic, so they're not going to have any impact. Peat moss is acidic. It might have minimal impact if you amend it into the soil, but once it breaks down, it neutralizes and it no longer has that effect on the soil pH. So really, you've got to do the elemental sulfur as the way to drop it. It takes time. And so that's the drawback. That's the best way to drop the pH for sustained lower pH for the acidity. But it's going to take time to add that sulfur, and it's going to take time for it to take effect, like months. So do it this year for next year if it's something that you really are looking for to lower the pH. All the other methods for a quick fix, I don't think it really is going to. There's nothing I would recommend. You can follow all those other tips, but they're a waste of time for any worthwhile lowering of the pH. Bettina says comfrey is great as a grass control, keeps grass from growing into the garden area. Yeah, I love that idea. It takes over, especially as it starts dropping its leaves. Uh, it's There's nothing else that's going to be growing there. As many nutrients as it has, those leaves are big and thick, and then that's why I like to spread them on the soil, not just for the nutrients, but also as a weed control. And cutting down grass, that's a weed if it's in an area that you don't want it to be. So good idea. Okay, I'm trying to get. Owen says, I would argue that diluted vinegar and water is less harmful than sulfur to microbes. So we're talking about different kinds of microbes. So the and the overall effect of microbes. So yes, the soil pH does affect which microbes are growing in the soil. And so if you're looking to lower the soil pH on a permanent basis, vinegar is not going to do that. It may give a very temporary effect. It's going to kill some of the microbes. But yes, as the sulfur lowers the pH, a lot of those microbes are also going to die as well. They're not going to be able to survive that lower pH. Instead, it'll be new species of microbes that can live in a low pH environment. And so having that longer period of time for the soil to transition to a more acidic environment gives more time for those soil organisms to die out and transition until the newer ones are living. That's not going to happen when you add a short-lived product like the vinegar. It's going to be harmful, not as harmful over a longer period of time, but it just doesn't have the same effect on the pH of the soil, and the microbes are important in releasing the nutrients to the plants, regardless of what the pH is. So, short-term fix, go for it. I'll advise against the vinegar, but if you want to use it, use it. It will affect the soil pH and it will affect the microbes, as will sulfur. You don't have to use sulfur. Just a tip, but it is one of those things that when we make that decision and we try one over the other, that's where the journal comes in. That's where the experience comes in. That's where keeping track of whether it works or not comes in to decide whether it's part of your method. And yeah, Boothby Garden says elemental sulfur will be effective longer. There you go. So it's how we choose to garden. I think that is really most important, and how you choose your tips, your methods, and what you share with others. is very personal, and I apologize if sometimes I come across as being too forward with my suggestions, but that's kind of just who I am, and that's how I get the information out there. But it is one of those things that uh, we need to recognize, who do we want our tips to come from? And there are a lot of people out there that I seek for advice. And there are a lot of people out there that I don't seek for advice, because maybe I had listened to them at one point, followed some of their advice, it didn't work, or I was already aware that the advice was less than accurate. And so I don't follow that advice anymore. But when I find someone that is encouraging and I try it and it works, then I want to try something else that they do. And I've seen that with some of the bigger gardening channels. And then suddenly they'll suggest something. And so I see this with Epic Gardening, for instance. Great channel. Kevin's a great guy. Lots of wonderful information. Biggest gardening channel out there. But when he gives advice for some of the plants and how to grow them, they're great tips if you live in San Diego, Southern California, or a comparable environment, because that's where they're filming most of the footage for their videos. If I were to try the same thing in my garden, it wouldn't work. They had a video a few months ago. I think it was like what you need to plant in May. And great video, great tips showing all the different plants they were putting in the garden in May. In May, my soil was still frozen. If I had tried to put those plants in my garden in May, I couldn't. I literally could not dig into my soil to transplant the eggplants that they said I should be putting into the ground. So that's why I say you have to consider the context. You have to determine the source, and hopefully have some information on that source. So, will I continue to watch Epic Gardening videos? Of course I will. Will I continue to try new things that they might propose? Of course I will. But if I recognize it as something that I know is not going to work, then it's a tip that isn't focused for me. It isn't appropriate for my garden. So I move on. I'm not going to discount everything they say because one tip doesn't work for me, but I am selective in which ones I decide are going to finally make a way into my garden. And that's what I'm encouraging from or with all of you as well, is use the advice until you don't, and try something new until you don't. And eventually you're going to be an old, experienced gardener and be telling others about your journey. And yeah, Jane is saying Epic Gardening works for me, but my coastal zone 10A is not normal. Yeah, it isn't normal. It's normal for you. And so don't get me wrong, it's perfectly normal in your area, but it's not normal for me in zone 5B. It's not normal for a lot of other places. But the basic information is still good. And that's what I look for, is the basic information. And so Sam says, I used to strive to copy John Kohler, but his environment and mine are worlds apart. LOL. Yeah. John Kohler was one of the first channels that I watched a decade, 15 years ago, when I was really getting involved with the YouTube and my channel as well. John Kohler's got some great information, great interviews with gardeners from all over the place. But same thing, he lives in that same environment that is not normal for some of us. But also, John Kohler doesn't start his plants from seeds. He buys all the plants that he puts into his garden. Beautiful gardens, beautiful plants. And occasionally in one of his videos, he'll talk about why he doesn't grow from seed, why he grows from a plant. Completely different from the way I do it, as I was just talking earlier about how I put everything in from seed. Even the stuff I grow that as a plant, a transplant, my peppers, an eggplant, and the tomatoes, I start those from seed myself indoors and put out as a plant. That's not something that John Kohler does. Does that mean his information is less useful? Not at all. It's just a different way that we're gardening and different environments that we're gardening in. And that's the key. As I was thinking about the video today, because I've said it a number of times. I hope you're not getting tired of it, but we really need to just slow down and be careful about where we get our information from. When we were talking earlier about not quitting, I think one of the reasons so many gardeners quit is because they're operating with bad information for them. It may be good information from someone else, but they don't recognize that they're listening to advice from San Diego, California, and they're living in Duluth, Minnesota. Completely different sides of our country with completely different ways of growing. And you start, doesn't work, you give up. Well, don't give up. Just be a little selective in the information that you're using. And if it doesn't work, try to figure out why it doesn't work. And then from there, your journey hopefully will become a little bit easier. Teenage Gardener says, I'm in West Virginia, but James Prigioni's advice always works in my garden. Yeah, another great channel. James Prigioni and Tuck. Great information, but they're the East Coast of the United States. He's in New Jersey. New Jersey has growing conditions that are normal for New Jersey. His information is great across the board. Some of the very specific tips on individual plants may or may not be appropriate. So another good example of a good source of information, but you need to be slow and try to recognize if it fits with your environment or not to make sure that it fits. And Tony's on Simplified Gardening is another great channel I'll throw out. I love my buddy Tony. And he agrees that James's channel is wonderful. I think Tony's channel is wonderful. He lives in Wales, completely different environment from mine. Like I mentioned earlier in the live stream, he's been dealing with endless rain for most of this year. The temperatures throughout the UK are just so much lower than they were a year ago. Completely different than what I have here in my garden. But when I grow potatoes in my Colorado garden, I'm following many of the tips, which for me have become methods that you'll find on the Simplified Gardening channel, because Tony's been growing a lot of potatoes over a lot of years, in addition to a lot of other plants, and it's good overall advice. Some of the specifics may not work in my hot, dry, windy garden, but I can still go to a great source for information for the things that I want to be growing and learning more about how to actually make it as easy as possible. I like easy. So that's the approach I try to take. Tammy says, your advice has been phenomenal the past 3 years. We have been very dry. This year, the drought ended. There was flooding. It is wet. I now have to adjust from dry to wet. Great topic to talk about. My garden is dry and wet. I've got videos on hail damage in the garden. Few of you have anything close to the kind of hail that I get here. I have 75 mile per hour winds and the humidity will be 15%. It's a unique environment for me. So my videos show what I'm doing. And I've had many people like Tammy say that it's really been helpful for dry areas, seeing what to do to get a garden to actually grow. And so I appreciate that. Modifying your methods is also very important. So when the conditions change, you need to change your methods. And so in the UK last year, they were dealing with hotter conditions, and tomato diseases started setting in that they'd never had before, like blight. This year, it's wet and it's cold, completely different conditions. You need to modify from one year to the next, maybe from one decade to the next. It depends on how quickly or how slowly the changes might be coming to your garden. But recognize that. That's why I say it's always a good idea to look at your tips and figure out where they came from and how they became part of your methodology, because at some point you may need to change the methods you're doing because the environment changes, or because your needs change, or because your plant choice changes, or because your soil changes. In the beginning, I do a lot of amending. to get my soil nice and rich and healthy. But at about the 4 to 5 year point, I slow down and I'm not doing as much amending because the soil reached the target. It reached the point that the nutrients are there and I don't have to keep amending. It's instead of an every year activity, maybe every 2 or 3 years. So when I give the tip, particularly for new gardeners, to amend your soil every fall, great tip. That's what I do until you get to year number 5 and then do a soil test and determine whether you need to amend at all. Change of methodology because what we did affected what's happening in our garden. So always keep learning, always keep analyzing, always keep trying to figure out what tip is going to work for you and which one isn't going to work for you. And modify and modify and modify. Sherry says, I hope your area doesn't fall victim to the fires that are plaguing the West right now. So we've been under health advisories for over a week now. Lots and lots of smoke in the air. It cleared out briefly over the weekend because we actually got a little bit of rain. Hadn't had rain in weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. Finally got some rain, washed out the smoke. The wind shifted. We don't have any wildfires, knock on wood, in my area right now. But there are some fires in Colorado. It's the huge fires primarily in California, and even from the fires in Canada, that smoke is coming down into my area. And so that's really affected. So as far as we're not a victim of the fires, but we're a victim of the smoke. And so we can only get outside. Last week, temperatures were so hot. This week, today, tomorrow, the next day, we may set record high temperatures yet again, and the smoke will probably start coming back in. So when it's that hot and that smoky, just can't get in the garden. So I'm glad that we don't have the direct impact of the smoke, but we are feeling some of the impact as I want to get out in the garden and may not be able to get out there because things are just too bad. Heidi says a lot of smoke in my area from here and Oregon, bad air. Yeah, it really does have an impact on how we garden and what we're doing. And Serena was asking the same question. So today it's not hazy. From my house, I can look and see the Rocky Mountains. Last week, I looked out my window and I could barely see the street 2 streets away. No chance of seeing the mountains. So it's been that bad. I mean, it really has been really, really bad visibility as we were moving forward and trying to figure things out. So as we move forward in our garden and we start thinking about these tips, start thinking about what tips you would give someone else. I asked for some of them. We got some good ones here today, and I appreciate all the chat going on as I was talking. And think about that. I think that's an important threshold for all gardeners to reach at different points. In the beginning, you're a newbie. You don't know anything about gardening, and you will take every tip you can get. Well, who's giving those tips? Those tips primarily are coming from more experienced gardeners. So as you become a more experienced gardener, start recognizing someone who maybe is less experienced and start sharing some of those tips that have worked their way into your methodology. If it's a tip that you have about the soil, about the watering, about bed placement, by all means, share that. If it's a tip about burying banana peels or burying eggshells, sure, you can share that. But I caution you to try to share the tips that you know have a foundation in some research, some practicality, some of your own evidence that you have used it and it has worked. And consider that a threshold. When you reach the point that you know more than somebody else, you are now a more experienced gardener. And it's almost a responsibility for you to share your tips so that the whole gardening community can benefit. And then there will be a second threshold. There'll be a point where the gardeners around you maybe have all reached about the same level of expertise, but you try something new and it works, and you do it again and you're able to repeat it. Well, now share that, because you are not just an experienced gardener, but you are a much more experienced gardener. And you can take that tip that maybe had just started with something you saw or heard and really turn into something much more. That's how I got to where I am today. Is I just kept reaching new thresholds where I knew a little bit more and a little bit more, and then I suddenly recognized that I knew a lot more than most of the people that were coming to me asking questions. So I started making videos and I taught classes and I tried to get that information back out into the gardening community. I'll put that on you. You don't have to do it. You can be all by yourself in your garden. I'm all by myself in my garden all the time. My garden is my happy place. But if you have the opportunity, consider sharing some of your tips so that you can really get out there. Mobius 981 has a great one. I think about my garden in terms of creating a micro ecosystem, the bigger picture overall. Completely agree. Look at the big picture in your garden overall for all of the things you're doing. But I think the reason I like this tip is because it spills over into life. Look at everything around you. Look at your friends, your acquaintances, new people, the strangers. Look at everything and try to figure out, can you have an impact? Can you give a tip that might make a difference in a person's day? And if you can, go for it. So great to be back. So great to be here. So great to have all of you here on my Monday. And I have every intention, setting aside potential problems with computers in the world, of being back next week. So I'll see you then. Enjoy gardening.